She sat at the train station with a sign, asterisk, I don't need a ticket, just food. Asterisk the Millionaire CEO stopped in his tracks. The station was alive with noise, trains screeching in and out, the hurried steps of strangers echoing off the cold walls, and the smell of fried food mixing with exhaust fumes that crept in from the street. Amidst the restless movement of the crowd, on the hard concrete floor near the ticket counters, sat a little girl who seemed completely out of place in such a vast and indifferent world. Her blonde hair fell in untidy strands across her pale face, and her blue eyes looked far too old for a child of 5. She wore a red sweater that had seen better days and a pair of jeans with frayed hems. Her small hands clutched a piece of cardboard with a message scribbled in shaky letters, I don't need a ticket, only food. The sign was almost too heavy for her to hold, and yet she sat there motionless, as if afraid that if she moved, she would vanish into nothing and no one would remember her existence. People noticed her, of course. Some glanced quickly and then turned their eyes away, embarrassed or unwilling to be drawn into her reality. Others walked past her as if she were invisible, as if she were just another piece of discarded luggage left behind in the chaos of travel. A few whispered to each other, shaking their heads, but no one stopped. No one reached down to ask why such a small child was sitting alone in a train station with a message that spoke of hunger rather than travel. The world was in too much of a rush, and her silent plea was drowned out by the rush of wheels and the endless drone of announcements. At that same hour, a sleek black car rolled to a stop at the curb outside. From it stepped Alexander Carter, the CEO of one of the largest airline companies in the country. He was a man used to commanding rooms, his broad frame and sharp gaze making an impression wherever he went. His dark hair was perfectly styled, his blue eyes carried an intensity that made people pause, and his light blue suit was tailored with flawless precision. He had just left a meeting with board members and was heading to a private lounge, his thoughts filled with numbers, contracts, and endless responsibilities. For a man like him, time was money, and he had no patience for distractions. Yet when he entered the station and his eyes fell on the little girl on the floor, everything inside him froze. Something about her posture, the way her shoulders hunched as though she were trying to make herself smaller, or perhaps the stark words on the cardboard, struck him with unusual force. He slowed his pace, his mind resisting the pull of curiosity while his heart urged him to look closer. He was a man who dealt with crises every day, but those were crises measured in profits and losses, not in the fragile survival of a child. He had lived long enough to know the world could be cruel, but seeing that cruelty pressed into the eyes of a child brought a pain that startled him. He stopped a few feet away, watching her for a moment as the crowd flowed around them like a river parting around two stones. She did not notice him at first, she kept her head lowered, her lips pressed together as though holding back tears she could no longer afford to shed. A surge of protectiveness rose within him, one he did not understand. He crouched down slowly, his shadow falling across the small figure, and for the first time she lifted her eyes to him. Those blue eyes met his, filled with distrust, exhaustion, and a flicker of hope so fragile it could vanish with the next breath. He did not speak immediately. For a man who was always prepared with speeches and strategies, he found himself searching for words. In the silence that stretched between them, the noise of the station seemed to fade, leaving only the quiet exchange of two lives crossing paths in the most unexpected of ways. Alexander realized in that moment that this was not chance. He did not yet know why, but he could feel that this encounter was going to change everything. Alexander stayed crouched in front of the little girl longer than he had intended, the cold of the tiled floor seeping into his expensive shoes as he studied her fragile frame. For years he had learned how to evaluate people instantly, board members, investors, competitors, but none of those instincts prepared him for the raw honesty in the child's expression. Her blue eyes were guarded yet pleading, and her tiny hands trembled slightly as she clutched the cardboard sign as if it were her last shield against the world. He could not help but notice how thin she looked, the way the sweater hung off her shoulders as though it belonged to someone else, and how her jeans were frayed and dirt-stained, a silent witness to days of neglect. She was not a child out for mischief or some childish game, she was a child surviving in a place no child should ever be left alone. The businessman felt a rare hesitation. His mind whispered that he should keep walking, that this was not his concern, that he could send one of his assistants to call a social worker or the police. Yet another part of him, the part he had buried under years of ambition and cold calculation, reminded him that once, long ago, he had been a boy who knew what it meant to feel unwanted. He did not like to think about those years before he built his empire, but the memory of loneliness crept back now with a force that shook him. He leaned closer, lowering his voice so that only she could hear above the noise of the station. "What are you doing here, sweetheart?" His tone was gentle, but his voice still carried that commanding presence that made strangers pause. She blinked at him, suspicious at first, as though expecting him to scold her or laugh like others had. For a moment she said nothing, and he thought she might remain silent altogether. Then, in a whisper so faint he had to lean in to catch it, she murmured, "I'm just watching them buy food. I don't need a ticket. I only want something to eat." The words hit him like a blow. This was not a child demanding toys or treats, this was a child stripped down to the most basic need, hunger. It unsettled him deeply. In his world, deals worth millions were signed over lavish dinners, contracts debated over fine wines, and here was a girl asking only for food. The contrast felt obscene, and guilt stirred in his chest, heavy and insistent. He found himself asking questions he never asked anyone: where are her parents? Why is she alone? How long has she been sitting here, hoping someone would notice? He reached into his pocket instinctively, pulling out his sleek leather wallet, but he paused, realizing that handing her money in a crowded station could draw the wrong kind of attention. He did not want to reduce her to another act of charity performed by a wealthy man. What she needed was not only food but safety, care, and someone who would not turn away. He slipped the wallet back and instead extended his hand slowly toward her, palm open, as though to show he had nothing to hide. The girl hesitated, her small fingers tightening on the sign. She glanced at his hand, then back at his face, searching for some sign of cruelty or deceit. He kept his gaze steady, his blue eyes softening with patience he rarely showed in the boardroom. Finally, her little hand left the cardboard and hovered uncertainly before touching his. Her skin was cold, almost frighteningly so, and he felt another jolt of anger, not at her, but at whatever circumstances had forced her into this moment. "Come with me," he said quietly, though there was firmness beneath his words. "You don't belong here, not like this." She bit her lip and seemed ready to refuse, but her stomach growled audibly, betraying her hunger. Shame flashed in her eyes, and she looked down as if she had done something wrong. Alexander's heart clenched at the sight. He gave her hand a reassuring squeeze, a silent promise that she did not need to be ashamed. As he helped her to her feet, a few passers-by finally seemed to take notice, some murmuring comments about the sight of the powerful CEO kneeling in the dirt-streaked station floor for a child. He ignored them. For once in his life, public opinion meant nothing. What mattered was the way the little girl leaned slightly into his side, uncertain yet desperate for an anchor. He guided her gently toward the quieter part of the station where his car waited, his mind already racing through possibilities. He could not take her back to her old life, wherever that was, without answers. But he also knew that he could not abandon her, not now that their paths had crossed. As they approached the exit, he glanced down at her again. "What's your name?" he asked. She hesitated, clutching the stuffed corner of her sweater in her tiny hand before whispering, "Emily." The sound of her name carried a fragile dignity, and Alexander knew in that instant that her story was just beginning, and so was his. For reasons he could not yet explain, he felt certain that fate had placed Emily in his path, and nothing about his carefully ordered world would ever be the same again. The following morning, Alexander found himself pacing in his penthouse apartment with an unease he could not shake. The skyline stretched out before him through floor-to-ceiling windows, the glass reflecting his own conflicted expression. He had awakened earlier than usual, stirred not by business calls or urgent messages but by the quiet sound of a child breathing in the guest room down the hall. It was an unfamiliar presence in his otherwise immaculate home, a reminder that the night before he had carried a lost little girl out of the chaos of the station and into his world of polished marble floors and silent elevators. Now, as the light of dawn filtered across the city, he wrestled with questions he could not ignore. He had not told anyone yet, not even his assistant, about Emily. He was a man who built empires by controlling information, keeping every detail of his life and company locked down, and yet here he was keeping a secret that felt heavier than any merger or acquisition he had ever managed. He walked past the guest room door and paused, hearing the faint creak of a bed as Emily stirred. He pushed the door open gently and saw her curled up beneath a blanket that looked far too large for her small body. Her blonde hair spilled across the pillow, and her hands clutched the edge of the covers as if she feared someone would take them away. For a moment he did not move, just stood there absorbing the fragility of the scene. When she finally opened her eyes, there was a flicker of fear before she remembered where she was. She sat up slowly, scanning the unfamiliar room, and then her gaze fell on him. For a brief second, she looked like she might retreat back under the covers, but then she whispered, "You're still here." The words were not said with suspicion but with quiet wonder, as if she expected him to have disappeared like everyone else who had walked past her in the station. He felt something tighten in his chest. "Of course I'm still here," he replied softly, stepping further into the room. "You're safe, Emily." Breakfast was awkward at first. She sat at the edge of one of his sleek dining chairs, her legs swinging above the floor, staring at the food laid out on the long table as though it might vanish if she reached for it. Plates of fruit, warm bread, and scrambled eggs that he hardly ever touched because most mornings he left before sunrise now became a feast for her. He noticed how carefully she ate, taking small bites as if rationing each one, and it made him wonder just how long she had been surviving on scraps or nothing at all. He poured her a glass of milk, and when she smiled at him shyly in thanks, he realized it had been a long time since he felt that simple kind of gratitude. As the day wore on, Alexander tried to focus on work, but the numbers on his screen blurred. Every time he glanced away, he thought of Emily sitting quietly in the living room with her feet tucked beneath her, flipping through the pages of a book he had left on the coffee table even though she was too young to read much of it. At one point she looked up and asked him questions he had no prepared answers for. "Why did you help me? You don't even know me." He froze, realizing that she deserved the truth. "Because someone should have," he finally said. "And because I couldn't walk away." She studied him with those serious blue eyes that seemed too old for her age, then nodded slowly as if his answer made sense in a way that words alone could not. Later in the afternoon, when he had to step out for a brief meeting, he found himself uneasy leaving her behind. He instructed the staff firmly to keep an eye on her, but as his car pulled away, he kept picturing her alone again, waiting in some corner, believing she would be abandoned. It struck him with a kind of urgency he had never felt before, that Emily was no longer just a stranger he had taken in, she was becoming someone he felt responsible for in a way that defied reason. He thought about the system she might otherwise be placed into, the institutions that would treat her as another case file, and he knew in his bones that he could not let that happen. That evening, when he returned, he found her asleep on the couch, a blanket draped clumsily over her shoulders, clearly placed there by one of the staff. He stood over her for a long time, his thoughts racing faster than they had in years. He had built his life on logic and strategy, but none of those tools could explain why this little girl had already altered the course of his carefully constructed existence. He realized then that he had a decision to make, not tomorrow, not eventually, but soon. Emily was no longer just a child he had rescued in passing. She was part of his life now, whether he had planned it or not, and that realization both terrified and thrilled him in equal measure. The following days unfolded in a way that felt both surreal and grounding to Alexander. For the first time in years, he found himself structuring his life not around boardroom agendas or shareholder meetings, but around the small rhythms of a child. Emily had begun to trust him enough to follow him from room to room, asking endless questions about the world that revealed how much she had seen but how little she truly understood. She wanted to know how the elevators worked, why the city lights never seemed to turn off, why his house was so quiet compared to the constant noise of the train station. He answered each question patiently, often surprised by how her innocence could cut through the hardened edges of his mind and remind him of things he had long forgotten to notice. One morning, Alexander decided to take her out, believing it was important for her to experience something beyond the polished confines of his penthouse. They drove together in the back of his car, the city sprawling around them as Emily pressed her face against the window, pointing out street performers, children in school uniforms, and the smell of fresh bread wafting from a bakery they passed. It was as though she was cataloging every detail of the world she had once felt excluded from, and he felt a strange pride in being the one to show it to her. When they arrived at a small bookstore he often visited in secret when he wanted to escape the relentless pace of his life, Emily's eyes widened at the walls stacked with stories. She ran her hands over the covers as though they were treasures, and he realized that something as simple as a book could feel like a luxury to her. He bought her several, though she protested, saying one would be enough. He insisted, and when she finally smiled, it was a smile that made the cashier pause and watch them with curiosity, as if trying to piece together the connection between this suited man and the small girl by his side. That night, back at the penthouse, Emily sat curled in a chair with one of her new books, and for the first time she laughed freely at something she found in the illustrations. Alexander stood nearby, nursing a glass of water instead of his usual scotch, and watched her. The sound of her laughter filled a void he had never acknowledged before. Yet beneath the warmth of the moment, a shadow lingered in his mind. He knew her situation could not remain informal forever. At some point, questions would be asked. People would notice her presence, and authorities might intervene. He did not want to think about her being placed in the cold machinery of the system that cared little for the individual child. The following evening, Emily surprised him with a revelation. They were seated at the dinner table, a quiet meal between just the two of them, when she suddenly put her fork down and looked at him with those piercing blue eyes. "Do you think my mom is coming back?" she asked softly. The question caught him off guard, pulling him into the weight of her reality. He hesitated, torn between the instinct to protect her with a comforting lie and the need to be honest. After a long pause, he admitted gently that he did not know, but he promised her she would never be left alone again. She studied him for a long moment, her small hands folded on the table, and then she simply nodded. That silent agreement between them felt like a vow, binding them together in a way more powerful than any contract he had ever signed. Soon after, an unexpected test of that vow came. A knock on the door late one night brought a uniformed officer and a social worker to his apartment. Someone had reported seeing Emily with him, and now they wanted to know what the situation was. Alexander's pulse quickened, but he kept his composure, explaining calmly that she was under his care for the moment. Emily, peeking from the hallway, looked terrified, her knuckles white as she clutched the edge of the wall. He excused himself from the officials and crouched down to meet her eyes. "Do you trust me?" he whispered. She nodded hesitantly. "Then let me handle this." Returning to the officials, he used every ounce of authority his presence commanded to stall them, insisting on a more formal process and leveraging his influence to buy time. When the door finally closed behind them, Emily rushed into his arms without hesitation, burying her face in his chest as tears soaked his shirt. He held her, realizing more clearly than ever that their lives were now intertwined. That night he could not sleep. He walked the halls of his apartment, every polished surface reflecting back his turmoil. For the first time, his power and wealth felt insufficient against the magnitude of the choice before him. He knew what needed to be done. He could no longer act as though Emily was merely a temporary guest in his life. She was a responsibility he could not walk away from, and the thought both terrified and exhilarated him. He understood that to protect her fully, he would have to confront the system head-on, no matter the risks to his reputation or his carefully controlled image. Looking out at the city lights, Alexander made a decision that would alter his life forever. He would fight for her, not as a benefactor or rescuer, but as family. The following weeks tested Alexander in ways that none of his years in business had prepared him for. Boardroom negotiations and billion-dollar contracts suddenly seemed simpler compared to the labyrinth of family courts and child welfare systems. Every day felt like a balancing act between running his company and making sure Emily felt safe, valued, and loved. He found himself rising earlier than usual, not to review quarterly reports, but to make sure Emily had breakfast before school. Sometimes she would chatter endlessly about the stories in her books or the funny things other children said in class, and other times she would sit quietly, staring at her plate with a look that told him she was somewhere far away in her thoughts. On those mornings, he resisted the urge to press her, understanding that trust could not be forced, only nurtured gently over time. One particular afternoon, Emily returned from school carrying her small backpack that looked too big for her tiny shoulders. She walked more slowly than usual, and when Alexander asked her about her day, she hesitated before admitting that some of the children had teased her again. They said she didn't belong in a school like theirs, that she was different, that she didn't have a family like they did. Hearing those words pierced Alexander more deeply than he expected. He felt a surge of anger, not at the children themselves but at the circumstances that had made Emily so vulnerable. Kneeling down to meet her eye level, he told her gently but firmly that she belonged anywhere she wanted to be, that the cruel words of others did not define her worth. She listened intently, her lower lip trembling, and then threw her arms around his neck with a sudden desperation that left him stunned. In that moment, he realized that his role in her life was no longer temporary. He was becoming the anchor she needed. That night, as Emily slept curled up with her new books and her small stuffed rabbit, Alexander sat in his study with stacks of legal documents spread out before him. He had begun the process of filing for guardianship, but the path ahead was riddled with complications. The social worker had made it clear that the system did not bend easily, even for someone of his stature, and questions about Emily's biological family would inevitably resurface. There were long stretches of time where Alexander sat staring at the papers, wondering if he was truly capable of giving her what she needed, or if he was simply trying to make amends for his own failures in the past. But each time doubt crept in, he thought of the way Emily's face lit up when she felt safe with him, the way she clung to his hand when the world seemed too heavy, and he knew there was no turning back. His resolve was put to the test when Emily fell ill with a fever one weekend. She had been fine the night before, full of energy and laughter, but by morning her cheeks were flushed and her body weak. Panic surged through Alexander as he called for the doctor, his mind racing with every possible scenario. Sitting by her bed, holding her small hand in his, he realized how fragile life could be, how easily he could lose the one person who had come to mean more to him than his entire empire. He stayed by her side through the night, reading her stories in a low voice even when her eyes were closed, reassuring her that he would not leave. When her fever finally broke, and she opened her eyes to whisper his name with a faint smile, he felt a relief so profound that it brought tears to his eyes. He had not cried in decades, yet with Emily, his walls crumbled without warning. The illness bonded them in a new way. Emily began to speak more openly about her fears and memories, including the nights she had spent at the station, listening to the trains and waiting for a mother who would never return. She confessed that sometimes she thought she must have done something wrong to be left behind. Alexander listened with quiet grief, assuring her over and over that nothing she had done could ever make her unworthy of love. Each word he spoke was not only for her but also a reminder to himself of the responsibility he carried. As spring arrived, Alexander began to notice how the world seemed different when viewed through Emily's eyes. A walk in the park became an adventure as she pointed out birds building nests or flowers just beginning to bloom. He realized he had walked past these things countless times without seeing them, too consumed by his own ambitions. Emily had given him a gift he had not known he was missing, the ability to feel wonder again. At the same time, he felt the weight of the looming court hearings pressing closer. The decision about Emily's future was no longer just a matter of his will but would depend on a judge, on lawyers, and on whether the world believed a powerful man could also be a father. Late one night, after Emily had gone to bed, Alexander stood by the window overlooking the city. The light stretched endlessly before him, a reminder of the empire he had built, yet all he could think of was the small girl asleep in the next room. His life, once defined by success and solitude, had shifted irrevocably. He was no longer driven by ambition alone but by a promise he had silently made, that Emily would never again feel abandoned. The thought of losing her ignited a fear he had never known, but it also fueled a determination that nothing, not even the complexities of the legal system or the doubts of others, would stop him from giving her the family she deserved. The weeks leading into the custody hearings were some of the most demanding days Alexander had ever lived through. He had weathered corporate scandals, economic downturns, and betrayals from people he once trusted, but nothing compared to the stakes of this fight. This was not about preserving his reputation or his company's future, this was about a little girl who had come to mean more to him than all the years of work he had poured into building his empire. Emily was the center of his world now, and as he watched her laugh one morning while feeding crumbs to the sparrows outside the kitchen window, he felt his resolve harden. Whatever the court demanded, whatever stories from his past were dragged into the light, he would not allow her to be taken away. Emily, still so young, could not fully grasp the weight of the legal process swirling around her, but she could feel the unease in the air. She asked questions in her small, serious voice, asking why men in suits kept visiting the house and why people kept calling her the girl in the case. Alexander never lied to her, but he softened the edges of the truth. He told her that some people wanted to decide what was best for her, but that he was fighting to show them she belonged with him. Sometimes, when she was quiet, she would lean her head against his arm and whisper that she didn't want to go anywhere else. Her trust was a fragile gift, one he carried with the same care as a priceless treasure. On the day of one of the first hearings, Emily sat beside him in the waiting room, clutching her stuffed rabbit tightly against her chest. Alexander was dressed in his usual immaculate suit, but there was a tension in his jaw that betrayed his calm exterior. He held her hand while they waited, ignoring the stares and whispers that followed them. Reporters lingered at the edges of the courthouse, cameras flashing, desperate for a photograph of the billionaire with the orphaned girl. He shielded her from the noise as best as he could, whispering small reassurances that everything would be fine. Emily believed him, even though the courtroom was intimidating, and the faces of strangers seemed sharp and judgmental. Inside the courtroom, the questions were relentless. Lawyers probed into Alexander's life, demanding explanations for why a man with no previous record of raising children should be granted guardianship of a little girl. They pointed to his wealth, his business schedule, his past relationships, anything that could be used to suggest he was unfit. Alexander answered steadily, his voice calm, but inside he felt each question like a blade. When the opposing counsel insinuated that Emily would be better off in foster care with a family trained to care for children, he nearly lost his composure. He forced himself to breathe and looked over at Emily, who sat quietly, her wide blue eyes locked on him as if searching for reassurance. That gaze reminded him why he was there, why nothing else mattered. The turning point in that hearing came when Emily herself was asked to speak. The judge, an older woman with stern features softened by kindness, asked her if she felt safe with Alexander. For a long moment, the courtroom was silent as Emily clutched her rabbit and swung her feet nervously against the chair. Then, in a small but clear voice, she said she wanted to stay with him because he listened to her and made her feel like she belonged. She told the court that he had sat by her bed when she was sick, that he never left her when she was scared, and that he read her stories at night so she could fall asleep without nightmares. Her honesty, so simple and unpolished, carried more weight than any polished speech Alexander could have delivered. Many in the room looked down, ashamed of their earlier skepticism. After the hearing, as they walked down the courthouse steps, Emily looked up at him and asked if she had done well. He crouched down, gathering her in his arms despite the cameras clicking furiously in the background, and told her she had done better than anyone could have imagined. In that embrace, he felt the enormity of their bond and the truth that had become impossible to deny: she was no longer just a child he had chosen to protect, she was family. That night, Alexander sat in his study once again, the city lights glittering in the distance. The house was quiet except for the sound of Emily's steady breathing in the next room. He poured himself a glass of water and thought about the path ahead. More hearings would follow, more challenges, more scrutiny, but the memory of Emily's words in court gave him strength. She had trusted him enough to declare before strangers that she wanted to stay by his side. That trust was a responsibility greater than any contract he had signed in his life. As he turned off the lamp and prepared to rest, he whispered a silent vow to the universe: no matter how long the battle stretched, he would not falter. For Emily, he would fight until the very end. The weeks that followed the first hearings were a blur of preparation, late-night strategy meetings with his legal team, and quiet evenings spent with Emily where he tried to give her as much normalcy as possible. Alexander knew that the battle for custody was far from over, and each step forward felt like walking through fire. The newspapers continued to run stories about him, questioning his motives and speculating on what kind of man would suddenly decide to take responsibility for a little girl who was not biologically his. Some painted him as a savior, others as a manipulator chasing after a redemption story. Alexander learned to ignore the headlines, but he could not shield Emily from the whispers she overheard at school or the curious looks from adults who didn't understand. One evening, after a particularly grueling day in court, Alexander returned home to find Emily waiting at the top of the stairs, her stuffed rabbit tucked under her arm. She had heard enough of the conversations around her to sense the tension, and her voice trembled as she asked him if someone was going to take her away. The question pierced him deeper than any accusation hurled in the courtroom. He sat on the steps with her, pulling her into his lap, and told her in a steady voice that he would never allow that to happen. She looked into his eyes, as if searching for cracks in his promise, but what she found there gave her comfort. She leaned her head against his chest, whispering that she just wanted to stay with him because he felt like home. The trial days stretched longer as the opposing side tried to dismantle every part of his life. They brought up his long hours at the company, his past failures, even moments from his youth when he had been reckless. Alexander listened calmly, but when it was his turn to speak, he chose not to fight back with anger. Instead, he spoke about the night he found Emily and how something inside him had shifted from that moment on. He admitted openly that he had not been looking for fatherhood, but that it had found him, and it had redefined his life in ways nothing else could. He spoke about the morning she ran into his study with her messy hair and her unfiltered laughter, about the way she insisted on saving half her dessert for him, about the nights she woke up crying and how she would only fall back asleep when he was by her side. His words silenced the courtroom in a way no cross-examination ever could. Emily was called upon again to speak, and though she was nervous, she surprised everyone with her quiet strength. She sat in the witness chair, her feet dangling, and spoke about the first time Alexander had made her feel safe. She told the judge about the nights when she was cold and hungry before he found her, and how now she no longer went to bed worrying if she would eat the next day. Her voice cracked when she said she didn't want to be moved from house to house because she had already found her family. Alexander, seated only a few feet away, clenched his hands together to stop them from trembling, overcome with pride and grief at the thought of how much she had already endured. That night, when they returned home, Emily surprised him by asking to stay up late. She wanted to sit in his office while he worked, curling up in the leather chair with her rabbit. Alexander let her, sensing that she simply wanted to be near him after the intensity of the day. At one point, she looked at him seriously and asked if he was tired of fighting. He paused, setting his pen down, and told her that no matter how tired he became, he would never stop. She tilted her head, considering his words, then smiled faintly and said she wasn't tired either, because she had him. It was such a simple statement, but it filled him with a renewed determination. As the case neared its conclusion, Alexander realized how much he had changed. He had gone from a man defined by his power and success to someone who measured his worth by the happiness of a child. The old version of himself, the one who thought winning was about wealth and influence, felt like a stranger. He was no longer fighting for his own pride or reputation. He was fighting because Emily deserved a father who would never leave her behind, someone who would protect her from the cruelties of the world and give her the kind of love she had been denied for so long. On the eve of the final hearing, Alexander stood outside Emily's bedroom door, listening to her soft breathing as she slept. He felt the weight of everything they had been through pressing down on him, but also the undeniable strength of what they had built together. She was no longer just the girl he had stumbled upon by chance. She was his daughter in every way that mattered. And tomorrow, he would face the court with the unwavering truth that no law, no challenge, no rival could erase, they belonged together. The morning of the final hearing arrived heavy with anticipation, and Alexander awoke before dawn, his mind already racing with the weight of the day ahead. He stood in front of the mirror as he adjusted his tie, noticing the dark circles beneath his eyes and the tension carved into his face, but beneath it all there was a calm resolve that surprised even him. Down the hall, Emily was stirring in her bed, clutching her stuffed rabbit as if it were a lifeline. When she shuffled into the kitchen still in her pajamas, Alexander crouched down to her level, brushing a strand of hair from her forehead, and whispered that whatever happened today, they would face it together. She nodded solemnly, her small hand slipping into his, and for a moment he felt as though she was the one giving him courage rather than the other way around. The courthouse was buzzing when they arrived, reporters clustering on the steps and snapping photographs as though this was just another scandal to be dissected in the morning paper. Alexander ignored the chaos, shielding Emily as they entered, his hand resting protectively on her shoulder. Inside, the atmosphere was tense, with the opposing attorneys already circling like sharks. The judge, weary from weeks of testimony, called the room to order, and Alexander felt Emily's fingers tighten around his as they sat down together. Today was the day the court would decide whether she stayed with him or was taken back into the system, and the gravity of that knowledge pressed on both of them like an invisible weight. The final arguments began, and the opposition painted Alexander as an impulsive man driven by guilt and publicity rather than genuine paternal love. They recited facts about his long work hours, the lack of biological connection, and his history of mistakes. Each word was designed to erode his credibility, to make the bond between him and Emily seem fragile and temporary. Alexander listened without outward reaction, but inside, he felt the sting of every accusation. Then his lawyer stood, calm and deliberate, and spoke not just of Alexander's wealth or status, but of the undeniable truth seen by everyone who had observed the two together: Emily was thriving under his care. She was no longer the timid, frightened child found abandoned and hungry. She was learning, laughing, and growing in ways that proved she had finally found stability. When it came time for Alexander to speak, he rose from his seat and faced the judge directly. His voice was steady, but there was an edge of vulnerability that cut through the formalities of the courtroom. He told the story of the day he first saw Emily and how her small, trembling voice asking for help had pierced him in a way nothing else ever had. He spoke of the nights she cried and how he stayed with her until she fell asleep, of the mornings when her laughter filled the house and reminded him of what it meant to be alive, of the simple truth that he had become a father not through blood but through choice. He admitted his imperfections openly, but then he said that perhaps the most important thing a father could give was not perfection, but the promise never to abandon a child again. The judge fell silent for a long moment before turning to Emily and asking if she wished to say anything. The courtroom seemed to hold its breath as she slid down from her chair and walked slowly to the front, her small hands gripping her rabbit tightly. Her voice was quiet but clear as she told the judge that she didn't want to go anywhere else because she already had a family. She said Alexander was the one who bought her food when she was hungry, who made her laugh when she was sad, and who stayed when everyone else had left. Then, in a moment that silenced even the harshest critics in the room, she looked up at the judge and said, "He's my dad." The words echoed in the hushed courtroom, simple yet undeniable, and Alexander felt tears sting his eyes as he realized she had spoken the truth both of them had known all along. The judge leaned back, his expression unreadable, before finally delivering his decision. He declared that Alexander would be granted full custody, citing not only his ability to provide but also the unmistakable emotional bond between him and Emily. The words washed over Alexander like a tide, and he felt the tension that had consumed him for weeks dissolve into overwhelming relief. Emily ran to him as soon as the gavel struck, throwing her arms around his neck, and he lifted her up without hesitation, holding her tightly as though he would never let go. Applause broke out quietly among the few supporters in the gallery, and even some of the skeptical reporters lowered their cameras, visibly moved by what they had witnessed. That evening, when they returned home, the house felt different, warmer, brighter, alive in a way it had not before. Emily insisted on celebrating with ice cream for dinner, and Alexander agreed without a second thought. They sat together on the floor of the kitchen, laughing between spoonfuls, both exhausted yet overflowing with joy. Later, as he tucked her into bed, she whispered that she was glad the judge had listened to her and that now nobody could take her away. Alexander kissed her forehead, promising her that she was safe, and as she drifted to sleep with her rabbit in her arms, he sat beside her, reflecting on how far they had come. For the first time in years, Alexander felt whole. He no longer measured his life by the empire he built or the headlines attached to his name, but by the steady rise and fall of Emily's breathing as she slept, by the certainty that tomorrow he would wake up not just as a CEO, but as a father. He had walked into a courthouse to fight for custody, but what he truly gained was something far greater, the chance to be the anchor in a child's life and the father she deserved. And as he sat in the quiet of the night, he understood that this was not the end of their story, but the beginning of a new one, written not by circumstance but by choice, love, and the unbreakable bond they had forged together.